Hi there, I'm Seth Resler. I am the community building consultant for Paragon. Thank you so much for being here today. Now look, if you are watching this live, then you know that we are hosting a virtual event right now. This is an opportunity for you to come and not only watch this presentation, but also to interact with your fellow public media broadcasters. We are really about fostering connection with these events. Now, if you're watching this as a recording or listening to this as a recording, you are just consuming the content. You aren't actually having the opportunity to interact with your fellow broadcasters. And I apologize, but that's okay because we are going to host future virtual events like this. This is actually going to be a series that we are calling Beyond the Broadcast that is really focusing on how public media broadcasters can get engaged with community building. And actually, if you are watching or listening to the recording, it's going to be a perfect illustration of one of the principles that we are going to talk about today, which is the difference between something that is just content that you can only consume without interacting with the other people that are consuming it, and connection and community building, creating a space where people can come together and actually connect with one another. So this is going to be an ongoing series of virtual events. This is actually the second one that we've done. We kicked it off with a virtual panel discussion, and that one was just a presentation. You can go and watch the recording of that, but I'm going to sum up some of what we talked about in that. So if you missed it previously on Beyond the Broadcast, here's what happened. What we talked about in that first panel discussion was that what people need from public media today is different than what they have needed from it in the past. Public media has always been about serving the underserved and providing for these communities that are not necessarily served by commercial media outlets. And throughout the history of public media, we have served the underserved through content, because when media first started, it was hard to do. It was expensive. It took a lot of really big equipment like printing presses or television studios or radio towers, and a lot of people who were specially trained to run that equipment. And so it was challenging to get content and distribute it to the masses. And you had to do that in order to serve the people who are underserved. But today things are different. Today, you don't need all that big expensive equipment. In fact, anybody with a smartphone and an internet connection can create content and send it around the world. So the way that people are underserved is different. It's not that they are necessarily underserved with content. They may be being underserved in other ways. And I'm not saying that, they're 100% totally served with content, but increasingly, content is super easy to get in this country. We are saturated with content, so there is less of a need for that. And in fact, this is affecting the revenue models of not just public media, but all media, from local newspapers to big Hollywood studios. All of these media companies, including public media, have revenue models that are premised on the idea that content is hard to produce, hard to distribute, and therefore scarce. And that's not true anymore. Content is no longer scarce. And so all of these media companies that have revenue models that are based on that assumption are facing challenges. And it might look a little bit different if you're looking at radio or television or public media or commercial media or films or newspapers or whatever. But really, at the end of the day, it's all coming down to that one single problem. There is too much content competing for too little attention, and the revenue models that assume that that content is scarce are no longer working. Now, there are revenue models out there that are working, and those revenue models are based on the idea that when more people create more content, these companies make more money. And those companies are tech companies. That is companies like Alphabet with Google. It's companies like Meta with Facebook and Instagram, companies like Amazon and Apple and TikTok. And when more people create more content, all of those companies make more money. But when more people create more content, media companies have more competition. And so they actually wind up losing money. So we're going to have to change the revenue model of public media. And make no mistake, that is what we are here to do with this Beyond the Broadcast series. We need a revenue model that is based on something that is no longer abundant. I mean, it's basic supply and demand. When there's too much supply, the demand drops. And so in that first panel discussion, we started to look at what is it that people in America need? What is the thing that is in high demand? And The conclusion was community. That community is the thing that we desperately need in this country. That we are facing a loneliness epidemic, that the lack of community is having a serious impact on our democracy, and that public media might have a role to play when it comes to building community. And so what we are going to do in this Beyond the Broadcast series is explore what it would actually look like if public media very actively, very purposefully set out to build community. And so that's going to take us to the topic of this first discussion. Here's what we're going to be looking at today. Let me pull it up on the screen here for you. We're going to talk about 5 things public media should know about building community. Now, in our future virtual events, we are going to bring in speakers from outside the public media broadcasting industry and have them talk about community and how they are dealing with this. Because this community concept, at least as far as we're going to talk about it, is most widely being used in Silicon Valley, specifically among software as a service companies. And so we're going to be talking to a lot of those folks. I am a big proponent of bringing in people from outside of the industry and talking to them and learning from them. I've been a consultant now for almost 10 years. And I will tell you straight up, my least favorite question is, what are other radio stations doing? Or what are other television stations doing? We tend to look at each other far too often and don't spend enough time looking outside the industry. Now, there are plenty of places and plenty of organizations that are creating spaces where you can find out what other broadcasters are doing, and you'll have the opportunity to do that here in between the presentations when you can actually talk to other broadcasters. But I, very importantly, want to bring in ideas from other industries and bring them in. So we're going to do that moving forward. But in this first discussion, it's just me. I'm going to talk to you because I really want to set the table for the rest of our discussion by talking about what we mean by community and what it actually looks like if we as public media broadcasters are to set out to build it. Now, before we start, I want to take a moment to define the word community, because this is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And frankly, we don't always define it when we use it. So I want to take a moment to do that. And look, this is a word where you're going to find a lot of different definitions. If you were to read 10 different books on community building, you would probably walk away with 12 different definitions. And that's a rabbit hole that you are absolutely welcome to go down. I think it's absolutely worthy of an academic discussion. And what do we really mean when we say community? But we're going to stay focused on action in these sessions. And so I am going to go with this definition. A community is a group of people who have a shared mission. They are all trying to accomplish the same thing. And they come together around that shared mission because they think that they can help each other accomplish that mission. And there's all sorts of things that are implied by this, among other things, that they have at least some shared values. And that's why they are coming together around that mission. So another way to think about it is to phrase it this way. We are a group of X who gather to do Y so that Z. So for example, one of the communities that I'm involved with is Podcast Movement. Every year I go to this conference with about 3,000 podcasters there, and they are a group of podcasters who gather to learn from each other so that they can become better podcasters. But you can imagine all types of other communities too. For example, a group of fans who get together to watch their favorite football team so that they can celebrate their passion for their game and their team with each other. All sorts of types of communities. So that's what I want to start with, is that a community is a group of people who have a shared mission. And that is going to bring us to the first thing that public media should know about community building. A community is not an audience. So let's start by looking at the model that we are all used to as broadcasters. And that model is fairly simple. We create content, and then we use that content to attract an audience. And then we monetize that audience somehow, and different broadcasters will monetize it in different ways. Obviously, in public media, we are asking for donations or sponsorships. In commercial radio, they insert ads. In Hollywood, they ask you to buy a ticket to access that content. But the idea is all the same, that we create content and we attract an audience. When you set out to build a community, you are doing something different. What you are doing is you are creating a space. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in a few minutes. But in that space, you are looking to attract community members who gather there and connect with one another. And that is the key difference between an audience and a community. That audience members don't talk to each other. They might talk back a little bit to the content creators, but not in any meaningful way, and they don't talk to each other at all. That's not the same with community members. Community members connect with each other. They communicate with each other. They build relationships with each other. And so that's going to be a key difference when we start talking about community building versus content creation. Now, if you look at the history of the internet, the first 30 years or so was really very much about publishing. It was about content creation. It was about the fact that we used to need that printing press, that radio tower, that television studio in order to get our content out to the masses. And now we don't, because we all have these tools that are much less expensive in order to create content. And so publishing tools have become much more accessible. You've got things like WordPress and YouTube and MailChimp and Facebook and so on and so forth. But now what we are seeing is the rise of a new set of digital tools. And I'll call these tools space building tools. And these space building tools allow us to create a space digitally where people can come together. And those are things like Zoom or Slack or Facebook groups or LinkedIn groups or Discord. All of these tools that became much more popular during the pandemic when we couldn't actually get together with each other in person. So we started using all these space building tools. And these space building tools are going to offer entirely new opportunities for us. As broadcasters, there's a whole lot more that we can do by creating spaces. And so that is going to take us to the second thing that we should know about community building, which is this. When we build community, what we are really doing is we are creating a space. Specifically, we are creating a space for those people who have a shared mission to come together and to connect and to help each other accomplish that mission. So I want to take a moment to look a little bit deeper into the different types of spaces that are out there. So we really have only 4 types of spaces at the end of the day. We have spaces that are in real life. So before the internet, these were the only types of spaces we had, where people actually physically get together. Now we also have virtual spaces thanks to the internet. But on top of that, there are perpetual spaces, spaces that are ongoing. I don't want to say forever, but they last a very long time. We also have spaces that are fleeting, that only last for a short period of time. So when we look at this, we have spaces that are physical structures, buildings, right? Something that is perpetual and in real life. So for example, a school is a space where people gather with the shared mission of learning. We have churches, which are a place where people gather with the shared mission of worshiping. We have office buildings where people gather with the shared mission of working. All kinds of physical structures that we can create. The fleeting in real life spaces are in-person events. I mentioned, for example, Podcast Movement, which is this conference of podcasters that get together. And Podcast Movement only happens, for a couple of days. And then, boom, the ballroom of the hotel turns into something else, and it is used for something else. So these are temporary spaces, but they are in real life spaces. And then in the virtual space, we have online groups. So something like a Facebook group or a LinkedIn group or a discussion forum where you can go pretty much 24/7. You can make a comment or write a post, and then somebody else can come along hours or even days later and respond to that. That's what these online groups are. Finally, we have fleeting virtual spaces, and these are virtual events, meaning that you actually have to show up in time. For those of you who are actually at this event right now and not watching the recording, that's what this is. You can connect with each other in real time, but you're only going to be able to do it if you show up for the short window while the event is happening. And then after that, you're not going to be able to do it anymore. So there we have it. We have 4 types of spaces, 2 of which existed before the internet. Those were physical buildings or in-person events, but obviously those require people to be in close proximity to each other. And now we've got both online groups and virtual events as well. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you as public media broadcasters that you all need to create a physical structure. right? Some of you actually have the ability to do that or may even have that already. And so you can use that as a place to gather your community members and take advantage of that space. But if you don't, that's okay too. Let's take a closer look at the model that we're going to talk about when we talk about creating a space. So we're going to set out to create a space. And to do that, we're going to use at least 3 of the types of spaces that are out there. We have in-person events, an online group, and virtual events. And you can combine all 3 of those in order to create a space. And so that is going to lead right into the third thing that we all need to know about community building, which is this. You cannot build a space with content alone. An analogy that helps me when it comes to community building is thinking of it like throwing a party. If you want to host a fantastic party, content absolutely can have a role to play. In fact, content's often what gets people to come to that party in the first place. Imagine that you hire a band or you hire a DJ to perform at your party. That may be the reason that people show up, but there's a lot more that goes into creating that space than just the content. You've also got to make sure that there are places for people to park and that there's food for people to eat and to drink. You've got to make sure that, the right people get in and the riffraff stays out, and that you've got a safe space for everybody to be in. Being a party host, those of you who do this on a regular basis, it's a lot of work. So you cannot build a space with content alone. Item number 4, community building is not the same thing as community engagement. And let's talk about the difference between the two, because both of them have a valid role to play and both of them can be very important. And I know that a lot of public media stations actually have somebody who has community engagement in their title. The difference basically boils down to this, that when you are doing community building, you are creating a space. And when you are doing community engagement or community outreach, you are going to a group of people who have a shared mission, but they already have a space, and you are engaging them in the space that already exists. There is a time and a place to do both, and it's really a judgment call. It could be very different from station to station and market to market. So when do you do one and when do you do the other? Well, there's no hard and fast rules, but here are some of the things I would consider. First of all, does a space already exist? If not, then why not? And is there a good reason to create one? In which case, yes, you would engage in community building. But if a space already exists, it may make more sense to actually engage or do community outreach. If a space already exists, the other thing I think you've got to ask is, would we have something more to offer or something more to bring to the table that isn't already there if we created a new space? And if so, even if that space exists, it may make sense to do community building, but if not, it may make more sense to just engage with the community as it already exists. Number 5 on the list, it's about engineering serendipity. And I learned this phrase a couple of years ago, and I absolutely love it. So what really got me into community building is that I had a podcast that was all about the Detroit arts and entertainment scene. And so we interviewed museum curators and festival producers and restaurant critics and so on and so forth, all in the Detroit scene. And it was very much like a public media show in a lot of ways. And then there was this global pandemic, and all of that shut down. And our podcast, which was about what to go do in Detroit on the evenings and weekends, all of a sudden there was nothing to do. So we pivoted, like so many people during the pandemic, and we started hosting virtual events where artists and entertainers from the Detroit scene could get together and could meet online. And I'll never forget, one day we're hosting one of these online meetups, and a guy walks in, and I ask him, what do you do? And he says, I fix up broken computers and I give them to kids who can't afford computers. He said, I'm trying to turn it into a nonprofit. And I said, what do you need in order to make that happen? He said, I need more computers and I need more kids. And so I said to him, hold on a second. And I pulled over a woman. Her name was Ann Jadamak. And she runs an organization in Detroit, a nonprofit called Arts and Scraps, which does essentially the same thing, except they do it with art supplies, not with computers. And I introduced the two of them and I said, you should talk to her. She knows a lot about this space. And I watched as the two of them sat there and talked for about 45 minutes. What I didn't find out until much later is that they have talked almost every month since then. And she has helped him. And he has now created a nonprofit that exists in 3 different states. That right there is called serendipity. And I knew when I saw that, I was like, if I could figure out how to bottle this, like that's the magic right there. And how do we recreate this and make this happen? Well, it turns out that there is actually a term for that. It is called engineering serendipity. And the idea here is that you can't make serendipity happen. There is a certain amount of luck involved, but you can create conditions under which serendipity is more likely to happen. And that's what you're trying to do with your space, is how do we create a space where serendipity is more likely to happen? And I'll give you a small example of how I've done this. So I've hosted a lot of virtual events for the NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters. And the big challenge that we have in the broadcasting industry is that we don't know where the next generation of broadcasters are coming from. So we created these virtual meetups to connect broadcasting students with professional broadcasters. And the hope is that we would get some broadcasting students into internships or even into jobs, that would be the serendipity that would come out of our events. And one of the things that we found as we hosted these events is that there was a simple thing that we could do that made it more likely for that serendipity to happen. And that simple thing was just to ask the broadcasting students on the registration form, where are they from and what type of broadcasting are they interested in? And that way, if they came in and they said, well, I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I'm really interested in sports play-by-play for television, we could say, oh, you need to go talk to, Susan over here. That's what she does. And that was a much more powerful connection than just letting them wander around the event randomly and hoping that they ran into each other. So it's just little things like that. So I want you to always be thinking about it. How can I engineer serendipity? How can I make the connections that are happening in my space more valuable to the community members who are gathering there? So there you go. That is the 5 things that I wanted to talk about today that you should know about community building. I think this is going to lay the groundwork as we have further discussions. And like I said, in future discussions, we will bring in other people from outside the public media broadcasting industry to talk about this. But I want to thank you so much for being at this virtual event. Again, if you're watching the recording, you are always invited to our future virtual events. We hope that you will join us so that you can actually interact with other public media broadcasters. But thank you so much to everybody today. And on behalf of Paragon, we're going to go back to the tables and let you talk to folks. Thank you for being here.